The Gemara that we learned yesterday, so we learned the Chotet Begadish Gemara, which is right before the Mishnah on page 16a. And in that Gemara, we basically had two versions of how to come to the conclusion of Rav Huna. In other words, Rav Huna qualified the previous Mishnah about a person making a area, making the space inside this pile of hay, and he was able to make a sukkah out of it. And the problem was that you can't dig out a sukkah without making proper schach. You need to put the schach on properly. A schach has to be schach. It has to be placed as something that covers. That's what schach is meant to be. It has to cover something. If you make a pile, then your schach is not placed there to cover something. It's part of a pile. It's not covering an empty area. It's not hovering over an empty area. So there has to be some hollow, be called schach, to be proper schach. And if you make the hollow, then what you've done is, if you make the hollow, what you've done is you've caused that the schach became schach after the fact that it was placed there. And that's a different problem called tasav leimin ha'asoy, that it has to be made schach. When you place it there, it has to be placed as something that covers over a hollow. So the way to get around this on a regular sukkah is you build the walls first. You have a whole hollow area, and then you put schach on. But what happens if you have a haystack? So Rav Huna says that if when you start out the haystack, you at least just leave a hollow of 1 handbreadth. It's not a full 10 handbreadth hollow. It's a simple, small, hollow area. A hollow area of 1 handbreadth. That already constitutes schach. This is called something that covers over a hollow area. It's called schach, and you placed it there as schach. You put it there as schach. It's not that it became something that covers. It's that you actually covered it, and by using this explanation, qualification, I should say, by using this qualification of Rav Huna, the way Rav Huna qualifies the Mishnah, that as long as you have 1 handbreadth that of space, that will allow this to be a kosher sukkah. And Rav Huna said that either to explain the Mishnah, or the way the Gemara says, it could be that he explained, there's 2 versions in the Gemara, it could be that he said this as a means to answer a contradiction, because the Mishnah says one law, it says that it's invalid, and there's a brisa that says it's valid when you dig out a hole in this when you dig out a hole in this haystack. So there is a brisa that says it's kosher. The Mishnah said it's not kosher. So to answer that contradiction, Rav Huna says, well, it's very simple. You have a haystack. If the haystack has at least 1 handbreadth of hollow, then it's already possible to use as it's considered schach, and you can now fix it by digging a bigger hole. That was the answer of Rav Huna. So again, Rav Huna might have just come to qualify our Mishnah and give his qualification by saying that the Mishnah is only talking about when you have 0 hollow area, but if you do have a 1 handbreadth, it'll be considered a kosher sukkah as long as you dig out and make a wall that is 10 handbreadths tall. You can make this into a kosher sukkah even without taking off the schach and putting it back on, as long as you had a hollow there in the first place, at least of 1 handbreadth. And the other way that the Gemara says it is, it could be that Rav Huna came specifically to answer this contradiction of the brisa and the Mishnah. And the way he answers the contradiction is by saying his qualification. But what comes out from this is, and what we mentioned yesterday also from the halacha, is that you need to have an area that's 1 handbreadth tall, but also it has to be 7 handbreadths by 7 handbreadths width and length. And only that area that's the area that is the width and the length of this 1 tefach hollow, only that area will be made kosher when you go and dig out more of the hay. Only that original area is going to be kosher. If you dig further in an area where you originally did not dig, there wasn't a hollow there in the first place, and you go and dig further, it does not extend. Your sukkah does not extend further than that original area that the 1 handbreadth height hollow was. So if you originally had a hollow of 7 handbreadths by 7 handbreadths and 1 handbreadth high, and then you want to extend it to 10 handbreadths by 10 handbreadths and 10 handbreadths high, you won't be able to use those extra few handbreadths as part of a kosher sukkah. So we're now on page 16a, and we just finished this is basically the Gemara that we concluded, and we did the Mishnah, the new Mishnah on 16a also yesterday. So let's go over that as well. So the Mishnah had mentioned over here, and welcome back, Ezra. Nice to see you. Nice to have you back. The Mishnah here on page 16a is a Mishnah of being Meshalshel Defanois. The word Meshalshel is an interesting word. You would think it would just say build Defanois, but it uses this term Meshalshel because Meshalshel is used when you're lowering something from high up. And so here what you did was you built a wall from high up, from the schach area. You have like a frame, and from the schach you were building downward. Or the way you're building the wall, and it makes sense, is that you're weaving. You're weaving some type of a textile wall to your sukkah, and the way you're weaving it makes sense. You tie the strings up to the original frame, the part of the frame that holds the schach, and then you'll start weaving it or crocheting or whatever, and ultimately reaching the bottom. The thing is, the Mishnah tells us that if it has 3 handbreadths of empty space on the bottom, in other words, if you stop weaving at a certain point and you leave a little empty on the bottom, if it's 3 handbreadths tall, so that will ruin your sukkah, according to the first opinion of the Mishnah. It ruins the sukkah. And we've mentioned this before, that there is a problem if goats could easily come in. So it's not considered a wall. If it's so easy for goats to enter, so it wouldn't be considered a wall. Now, interestingly, the Gemara uses the term that it's mechitza teluya. The term the Gemara uses is that it's a hanging wall. And if the wall went closer to the ground, and we would say lavud, and we wouldn't call it a hanging wall. But now we're calling it a hanging wall. It's a term the Gemara uses. Now, but the simple understanding is not that the wall is a problem because it's hanging. The problem is the fact that there's empty space under it that causes us to we're going to call this a hanging wall because there's empty space, and the goats could come, could easily come through, and they can't call that a wall. Now, the Mishnah then mentions what happens if you're going upward. If you're going upward, then it would be not a problem to leave empty space. Going downward, you got to go all the way down, at least till within 3 handbreadths. But going upward, then you could go just 10 handbreadths, and afterwards there's a rule of good asik. And the way we explained it yesterday is not that the rabbis disagree and hold that you don't say good asik going down. They would say good asik going downward, except that if there's an area that a young goat could walk through easily, then we won't be able to call it a wall. Yes, Mordechai.
Yeah, that kind of reminds me the upstate development where I am right now. I think in the past couple of years they replaced the fence around the trash compactors, but due to it being like on an angle, the right gate has like a space of a foot uh, gap below it, and there were bears that are able to get in. And so I guess that would not be considered, I mean, like similar to this with the goats, that would not be considered good meat if bears are able to slip in through the bottom.
Well, that's interesting that you have bears in that area. Do you walk around with bear spray?
No.
Uh-huh. So I would be I would be scared. Wow. Well, yeah, the Gemara's term is goats. If bears could get through, then for sure it's a much bigger problem. Sounds like goats is all you need is 3 hand breaths. So it's approximately 9 inches. It might be a drop more. A hand breath is 3.15 inches, if I'm not mistaken, according to Rabbi Avram Chaim Noah. So if it's 3.15, it's 9 inches and what point 9.4 maybe nine something like that. One 9.45 maybe. So so yeah, so that would be so anything bigger than that would not be called a wall according to the rabbis. Now, the Mishnah also mentioned
Rabbi, what's good asik again?
good asik means we pull and extend the wall upward. And that's the typical Florida sukkah, is a good asik sukkah. The typical Florida sukkah, we have lattice on the bottom half, and the upper half has no wall. And it's all you have a wall is about 48 inches generally. And that doesn't have to be that big. It could be smaller, but it's generally about that size because that's like that's the size they make lattice. And the upper half of our sukkah is empty. Why is it a kosher wall? Because we consider it that the wall extends up to the schach, and it's called good asik mechitzasa. We stretch and upward the wall to make it a full wall for your sukkah. And the going downward, if you wanted to do it the opposite direction, what happens if you wanted to put lattice on the top of your sukkah and the top half and leave the bottom half empty? The opinion of the rabbis based on our Mishnah is that this would be puzzle, invalid. Now, Rabbi Yossi argues. Rabbi Yossi says that the same way you can go upward, and we say that we extend the sukkah asik, we extend the sukkah upward. There's also a term good aches. We could extend the sukkah downward, and that's Rabbi Yossi's opinion. And according to Rabbi Yossi, all you would need to do would be put your lattice on the top of the frame of your sukkah, and then according to Rabbi Yossi, you could have the whole bottom could be empty and could be without any wall. And we would say good aches mechitzasa. Now, the law of good asik and good aches, this law is a halacha l'Moshe miSinai. It's a law given to Moshe at Sinai. We've learned about it before. And all I mentioned yesterday, what I added yesterday, was that the Aruch LaNer clarifies a certain understanding here. And not that everyone agrees with him, but it definitely sounds logical. What he mentions, that that everyone agrees that there is a concept of good asik and good aches, that both are part of the halacha l'Moshe miSinai. And the fact that the rabbis don't allow you to use it as a wall, how could they say something like that if it's the halacha l'Moshe miSinai? What are the rabbis, what are they telling us? So all they're saying is Yeah, the wall could be considered a wall if you didn't have an issue of the goats coming through. So if you somehow remove that obstacle, you actually could say the law of good achas. Even the rabbis would say. And he gives an example. And the example he gives is a very simple example where you have your sukkah. Let's say you would have your sukkah on the bottom of your sukkah, you put a small, tiny, like a frame that goes up to 3 handbreadths, so it blocks any goats from coming. Let's say you had such a sukkah, so you have like 10 inches, let's say, of a frame. The bottom frame of your sukkah is, let's say, 10 inches. So that would be 3 handbreadths. And the goats cannot easily just walk in. Now you have lattice on the top half of your sukkah. So you're hanging your lattice from the top of the frame. And so you have a whole gap in between your bottom frame, which is 10 inches tall, and the lattice that's on the top of your sukkah. It's going along the entire top, the whole lattice. So you got a 4 feet height of lattice, let's say, but you still have a number of feet in the middle of the wall that's empty. According to the rabbis, that would be a kosher sukkah. Even though the Mishnah says that the rabbis hold you have to put the wall all the way to the bottom. The Aruch Lener explains that that only would apply if you don't have that bottom frame that's 10 inches tall. But once you have that bottom frame that's 10 inches tall, it's 3 handbreadths, the goats can't go through. So now we have the halacha l'maisha misinai law. We have the law given to Moses at Sinai that there's something called good aches and good asik, that it could go upward, your wall could go downward. When do we say the wall goes upward and the wall goes downward? As long as the wall originally is 10 handbreadths. As long as you start with a solid 10 handbreadths, and I don't mean solid. You can have holes inside those 10 handbreadths, but it's like lattice. As long as it doesn't have a gaps of 3 handbreadths gaps, then it would be a kosher sukkah. So that was the Mishnah yesterday, and the Gemara said that my komiflagi. Let's just start. We're going to start again from the Gemara here. So we're on page 16a. We're at the bottom of the page, maybe 6 or 7 lines up from the bottom. 16a. My komiflagi. What are they arguing about? And this is the question of what's behind the argument of the Mishnah. We know Reb Meir. The first opinion and Reb Yossi are arguing, and we know what they're saying. We know what the laws are. But what's behind those laws? What's going on? Why are they saying their law? That one says you can't extend the walls downward and it's puzzle. The sukkah would be puzzle, invalid. The other one says you can extend the walls downward and it would be kosher. What's the reason behind it? So the Gemara says, but my commitment, what are they really arguing about? And the Gemara says, Mar Savar Mechitza Tuluya Materas, master, which the Gemara is referring to Reb Yossi's opinion first. It says he holds that Mechitza Tuluya, a hanging wall, is considered a wall. It's matir. It allows, which basically means it's a kosher wall, or it's matir you to use it as a sukkah. It permits it. And Umar Savar, and master holds, which means the first opinion of the Mishnah, which generally we consider the opinion of the rabbis. It doesn't say a name, so it's that opinion is machitza tluya eina materes. A hanging wall, it does not permit this to be a kosher sukkah, and it would be invalid. And the Gemara uses the term machitza tluya, hanging or not hanging, but it's based, the way we explained it, it's based on the fact that the goats can go through, and that would be possibly a reason why it's not considered a kosher wall. What I mean to say by this is that the term mechitza tluya sometimes would make someone think that, it has to do with the fact that it's hanging. That's the problem. The problem is it's like it's hanging. It's not. It's just so temporary or something like that. But the way the Aruch LaNer is explaining it is that it's not about hanging. It's about the fact that it's not going to the ground to block the goats. That's the idea, that it's hanging, and therefore it would not be considered because there's an area that the goats can get through. It's not considered a proper mechitza. So that's the machlokes. That's the way we've explained the argument in the Mishnah. Now the Gemara brings another case where we have an argument also about a mechitza that is hanging. Tanan Hassam, we learned over there, and this is a case that's a Mishnah in Eruvin, and it says over there, Bar Shabein Shtei Chatzeros. If you have a cistern in between two courtyards, so what you have is a person has their house in the courtyard, and the next courtyard has another house. And so now you have a cistern where they would draw water from. So each of these courtyards had half of a cistern in their property. And the case was that the person's property had a fence in between it, blocking their property from the next person's next door neighbor. And nevertheless, the cistern was in between, and therefore the wall just went right over that cistern. So it was a wall that didn't touch the ground for a few feet, because there's a cistern under a few feet of it, where half of it is in one person's property, half of it is in the other person's property, and then the wall continues and basically blocks the two courtyards from being able to walk one to the other. And the only thing is that the water in the cistern, so each person takes from their side of the cistern, they can take water. And the problem that the Gemara is dealing with is that water mixes around. So when you take from your part of the cistern, there's a little of the water, some of the water is coming from the other side of the cistern. And you're ultimately taking from one chotzer, from one courtyard to another courtyard without an eruv. And normally, even though they're both private properties, they're both individual properties that have a gate around them, but nevertheless, you can't, at least rabbinically, you can't carry from one private property to another private domain without having an eruv chatzeros, without you collect the bread, challah, matzah, and you join, and then you join together as if you're one big happy family. And here you didn't do that. You can't do that, actually. The reason you can't do it here is because if there's a wall that separates the courtyards, then there's no way to join together. The only way to join together, only two courtyards that can join together, is if there's actually a walkway in between, or some type of window or door that you could get through. Then you could actually be considered to be an eruv, and you could consider making an eruv. Here, you can't make an eruv, and you didn't make an eruv, and you can't make an eruv, and now it's Shabbos already. And so what would the din be? I think someone had a question. Did someone have their hand up? I'm sorry, I guess not. Okay. So the Gemara says, it brings this Mishnah, and the Mishnah says that ein memalin mimena b'Shabbos. You can't fill from this cistern on Shabbos because you're bringing some water from your friend's property. Ella imkain asula mechitza asara tefach. The only way you can do it is if you make an intentional wall that's 10 handbreadths tall, which by making this extra wall, which we'll soon see where it has to be placed, but by doing that, what you're showing is that you're aware of this issue of taking something from another person's property, and you're specifically making a wall to be able to separate the to sort of like give a siman, a sign that you're separating the property. So what do you need to do? So it says you need to have made a wall, and of course not on Shabbos, but before Shabbos, a mechitza asara tfachim, and it has to be 10 hand breadths, which we just said is around 31.5 inches. Bein milmaila, whether you make it above, which means far from where the water is. Let's say the water level is only 5 feet below this top of the cistern. So let's say you're not having it anywhere near the water, so it's above milmaila, or bein milmata, whether below near the water. Maybe it's right by the water. And in that case, either whether you made it above or below. Actually, I'm sorry. There is a question of the girsa over here, and I have to mention that. Bein milmaila, Rashi over here doesn't have that. Rashi only says bein milmata, bein mitoich ugnai. They seem to take out those two words, bein milmaila. And I have on the side over here as well. A second. So I'm just going to skip those two words, bein milmaila, because Rashi doesn't have it, and basically it's the two options that we have is bein milmata, bein b'soich ugnai. And bein milmata means whether it's close to the water, or whether b'soich ugnai, it means it's by its lip, by the edge of the cistern. There's a little lip, let's say, that the cistern goes up above the earth, and by its lip you have this extra wall that you're making. So you made a wall either by the top or below it. And Reb Shimon ben Gamliel says that there's an argument Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. Now let's turn the page. We're on page 16b. Beis Shammai yomer milmaila, Beis Hillel yomer milmata. Beis Shammai says that it's okay if you put the wall, this extra wall that you're building, which is inside the cistern, it's okay if you put it above the water, which would basically follow the first opinion. In Beis Hillel milmata, it has to be close to the water, and only then is it clear that the mechitza, this wall, was made in order for you to carry the water. Now, Beis Shammai is basically saying either is okay, even if you do it above. It's enough if you just build it above. I guess it's easier to build it above. And Beis Hillel says, no, you have to build it lower, near the water, because only then is it more recognizable, the purpose of it. And so we've got these two opinions, basically, that either everyone agrees that you can make it either above or below. We have Reb Shimon ben Gamliel that says it's a machlokes Beis Shammai Beis Hillel, if it has to be below or it could also be above. And now we have another opinion. Amar Reb Yehuda. Reb Yehuda says, Loi tehei mechitza gedayla min hakoisel shebeinehem. The mechitza, this wall that you're going to make inside the cistern, it shouldn't be any greater than the wall that's already there, that's existing already. And since you have a wall that's existing already, you don't have to make any more of a wall. So the earlier opinions both said you needed to make a wall. The only question is, does it have to be lower or could it even be on the upper area? But the upper area of the cistern. But Rabbi Yehuda says that you don't need a wall, an extra wall there, because whatever you have there is already good enough, because that wall that extends over the cistern will be considered a kosher wall to allow you to take water. And the understanding is that, and we'll soon see in the Gemara, that the understanding is that according to Rebbe Yehuda, a wall that's above is called a kaisel, that is tluya, a hanging wall, because below it there's nothing there, and except a cistern, there's empty space, and then there's water and so on. It's deep. So it's not touching the ground in that area. And nevertheless, Rabbi Yehuda says it's considered a good wall and you don't need anything else. So according to Rabbi Yehuda, we see this concept of a mechitza teluya, a hanging wall, that it's going to permit the taking of the water from the well. Okay, so this is the another case where we have the mechitza teluya. The Gemara now says, Amar Rabba bar bar Chana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabba bar bar Chana says the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Yehuda b'shitas Rabbi Yosi Amra. Rabbi Yehuda, who says his law right here about this wall that's above a cistern. Rabbi Yehuda is saying this law is following Rabbi Yosi of the Mishnah that we learned in Gemara Sukkah, what we just learned on page 16a, that Rabbi Yosi holds that you could build your Sukkah with an only upper wall, and we will consider it as if the wall extends downward. The first opinion in the Mishnah, the rabbis, they didn't hold of that. But Rabbi Yosi held of that, said we could consider your wall that it extends downward. The Gemara here says, guess what? The Mishnah in Eruvin has an opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, and that Rabbi Yehuda is basically following Rabbi Yosi. Rabbi Yehuda is following the opinion of Rabbi Yosi, and that a wall that's hanging, it'll work for Shabbos. It works for Sukkah, it works for Shabbos. Called a hanging wall. It's considered a kosher wall, and you would not need to build some type of a extra wall that makes like a symbol that they're two separate two separate properties. We don't need that. You don't need that. Your wall that's hanging is considered to be extended down, and so that's the. This is the Gemara's understanding of the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda that it's following Rabbi Yosi. Now the Gemara says, but it's not so. Rabbi Yochanan understood it this way, but the Gemara says no. It's not. It's not as it sounds. Because there's really a big difference between the laws of Sukkah and the laws of carry. There's a big difference. There's the laws of carrying from one domain to another on Shabbos. And just because one rabbi says it regarding one of the laws, it doesn't mean that they would say it regarding the other laws. And the same thing vice versa. Even if they say it in those laws, it doesn't mean that they're going to say it in these laws. What does the Gemara mean? So the Gemara says, Veloihi, but it's not so. Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Bar Bar Chana said the name Rabbi Yochanan, that Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yosi both hold the same thing. But Veloihi, the Gemara says, but that's not so. It's not that Rabbi Yehuda follows Rabbi Yosi. It's not so. And And why is that? So the Gemara says, "Loi Rabbi Yehuda sav like Rabbi Yosi, Rabbi Yosi sav like Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda doesn't hold like Rabbi Yosi. Rabbi Yosi doesn't hold like Rabbi Yehuda. Loi Rabbi Yehuda sav like Rabbi Yosi. Ad kan like Rabbi Yehuda hasam elabe ruve chatzeros." Until here, we don't know of Rabbi Yehuda's saying his law anywhere else, only by Eruv Chatzeros. He says it over there. Until now, we don't know him saying this law anywhere else. Why? Eruv Chatzeros, there's room to say that's different. He could be very lenient over there. It's D'Rabbanan. Eruv Chatzeros D'Rabbanan. Eruv Chatzeros is rabbinic. And biblically, you could carry from one domain that's a private domain to another private domain. So biblically, this wouldn't be a problem. It's only rabbinically that there's an issue. So rabbinically that there's an issue here, Rabbi Yehuda can say, well, okay, so the rabbis didn't want people to carry from one domain, the private domain, to another private domain. They said you got to make an eruv. But if you have a wall that's there already, and it's separating the cistern, and you're not going from one domain to the other. It's only some water that might come from the other domain, and there's a wall there, and it's a rabbinic, this is a whole rabbinic law. It's good enough. We can rely on the lenient way of looking at a mechitza tluya, and we could say this wall is a good enough wall. There's a concept of good aches. It's a wall, it's good enough. So it's a rabbinic law. Aval hacha. But here, Sukkah d'oraisa, here, Sukkah is biblical. We're not going to hold, Rabbi Yehuda is not going to hold that it's good enough and you can go downward. He's going to say, well, you have a problem of the goats, and you know it's not exactly a mechitza. It's not exactly a proper wall that could be used for a biblical law. Rabbinic law, so the rabbis didn't uphold their rules as much. They could have, so it's only rabbinically. But to fulfill a biblical law, we got to cover all grounds. And he's going to say that you would need a better wall, not a mechitza tluya, not such a hanging wall. So this is the first half of explaining that Rabbi Yehuda might only say his law regarding the laws of Eruv. Now comes the second half. Now comes Rabbi Yosi. But Rabbi Yosi savalak Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabbi Yosi does not hold of Rabbi Yehuda. Ad kan lekam Rabbi Yosi hacha ela b'sukkah. Till here, Rabbi Yosi did not hold of his law only regarding Sukkah. In other words, we don't know that he says this law in other cases. He says it by Sukkah. The mitzvah aseh, it's only a mitzvah aseh. It's a positive commandment, and for a positive commandment, there are certain extent. There's an element of being lenient, and the reason being it doesn't carry with it punishments like negative commandments. A negative commandment is carries with it very severe punishments, and therefore you would need to be more strict. So it's a mitzvah saseh. He says you're allowed to rely on a mechitza tluya, this hanging wall. You can rely on it. It's kosher for a sukkah. Mitzvah saseh. Chag sukkah is tasel, right? And that sukkah is teshu shavas yamim, right? It's positive mitzvah that you could that you are fulfilling. It's good enough, but Aval Shabbos, the Isser Skila, but Shabbos is an Isser Skila. It carries with it a penalty of being stoned if a person transgresses the laws of Shabbos, which carries with it a very strict punishment. So there, Rabbi Yosi might not say his rule. And the only thing is, it's interesting because we are just saying that maybe Shabbos should be very lenient. It's only rabbinic. And now we're saying Shabbos is an Isser Skila, very strict. So which one is it? Is it carry with it a penalty of stoning, or is it a rabbinic law? Right? The previous paragraph just said that Eruv is only drabanan, and now we're jumping to say Shabbos is an Isser Daraisa. It's a biblical law. It carries with it very severe capital punishment. So which one is it? So the answer is that it is drabanan. It is rabbinic, and it doesn't carry with it a law, the punishment of stoning. But the original law of doing work on Shabbos, that does carry with it. In other words, it's the laws of the rabbis are based on the biblical laws. So because this is such a strict biblical law, when the rabbis made their laws around it, they also included a very strict element, ke'ein da'araisa, similar to the Torah law. In other words, they were more machmir, they were more strict in their rules because it's they're basing it on a biblical law that's very strict. But when it comes to the laws of Sukkah, there you could be more lenient because it's only a mitzvah saseh. It's all about fulfilling a positive commandment and not about transgressing a negative or a rabbinic law that is in connection to transgressing a biblical law, which is a negative commandment, which carries with it capital punishment. So that's the Gemara's rebuttal or argument on Rabbi Yochanan. Now the Gemara says that v'im taimar, and if you're going to say Maisa Shanasa b'tipayri al pi minasa. You may ask a question and challenge what we just said, because what we just said was that Rabbi Yossi might not hold of his law regarding Eruvs, but there's a story. And that story happened in Tzipori. And Tzipori is the place where Rabbi Yossi is the chief rabbi. And he was the Rosh Shel Yeshivas Tzipori. He was the head of the yeshiva in Tzipori. And in fact, Rashi brings a Gemara in Sanhedrin that says that you're supposed to go to a good Bezdin, Tzedek Tirdoif, peace, righteousness or justice. You should pursue justice. It says it twice. Tzedek, justice, you should pursue. And so the Gemara in Sanhedrin says, you know what that verse means? What it means is that you should go to a good Bezdin, a good court. And what is a good court? And the Gemara says, you know what a good court is? Rabbi Yossi in Tzipori. He was like a proper scholar. And you want to ask people who know the laws well, and that would be like Rabbi Yossi. He would be the right type of person to ask a shaila. He would be a good Bezdin. So we see that Rabbi Yossi is the rabbinic authority in Tzipori. And there's a story that happened in Tzipori where they permitted carrying something with walls that were hanging walls. And the Gemara understands that you would probably think, well, if it happened in Tzipori and they permitted hanging walls, it must be that it was Rabbi Yossi who gave that ruling. This is his place. It must have been him who gave that ruling. And if it's him that gave that ruling, guess what? Rabbi Yossi not only says it on page 16 in the laws in the tractate Sukkah, but he obviously holds the same law regarding the laws of Eruvin. And therefore, he gave a ruling that allowed them to carry on Shabbos between two private domains without an Eruv, but using some type of hanging with regard to a hanging machitza tluya, a hanging wall. So it must be that It was Rabbi Yossi. So Rabbi Yossi must hold his law both places. So the Gemara says, no. If you want to say the story that happened in Tzipori, who was the author, who was the source of that story? Lo al pi Rabbi Yossi. It was not based on Rabbi Yossi. Ela al pi Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yossi. The story was based on Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yossi. It was after Rabbi Yossi passed away. Rabbi Shmuel permitted a certain type of mechitza on Shabbos. He permitted it, and therefore it's not a proof that Rabbi Yossi would have agreed to this, because his son might have been more lenient than he was, and his son permitted this, but not necessarily would he have agreed with this. He would have possibly been more strict, because it's the laws of Shabbos. Shabbos is a Isser Skila. The original law of Shabbos is a capital punishment. And maybe Rabbi Yossi himself would not have agreed with this. That's what the previous Gemara said. And the Gemara now is upholding it and saying, yeah, even though there is a story of Tzipah and Tzipori, but this story that we're going to see, it really is a story that happened with his son. It was Rabbi Yishmael Rabbi Yossi. It was after his father died, and he might argue on his father, and he permitted this thing. So the Gemara says, "Umay Maisa, what is this story that we are talking about? Where one of the rabbis permitted a mechitza, something with the mechitza tluya, something to do with a hanging wall, a wall that didn't go to the ground. What was this story?" So Gemara says, "D'chi asa Rav Dimi." When Rav Dimi came from Eretz Yisrael to Babylon, Amar, he said, Pam achas. Tzipori was, by the way, somewhere near Tveria, and it talks about people in Tveria and Tzipori. I don't know if you remember, but I think we learned it in Tractate Brachas about people would accept Shabbos in one place and extend their Shabbos. Shabbos got over later, and then the other place. Anyway, it's right near Tveria. Hey, so the story of Tzipori got to the rabbis in the Talmud of the Gemara. The Gemara is in Bavel. These are the rabbis in Babylon. How did it get to them? The story got to them because Rav Dimi came, and he told them this story. He came from Eretz Yisrael, and he told them, "Pa'am achas shachu v'lahiviu sefer Torah me'erev Shabbos." There was a problem, and they didn't bring a sefer Torah before Shabbos. And normally they would have brought this Torah obviously before Shabbos, and they would maybe normally keep it in a safer place, but for Shabbos they would bring it to where they needed to for them to read, and then after Shabbos, I guess they would bring it back to a more secure place. So they forgot to bring it before Shabbos, and the problem was the place where they needed to bring it from was the Beis HaKnesses, was the shul. And now the problem is that shul had many other courtyards opened up to it, or houses opened up to it. And many houses opened up to that courtyard. And they didn't have an Eruv. So you can't bring it from the shul to these houses, because it's they never made an Eruv. You can't bring it to the courtyard. And so again, the shul they're davening in on I think I said it wrong. The shul they're going to daven in on Shabbos, and they're bringing it to the shul. And because they need to bring it to the shul, the problem is they can't, because there were many houses opened up to that.
Hi, Don.
Let me just mute everyone 1 second. Okay, so let's read the Rashi over here. Rashi on the side, he says, "My mice." He says, "What's the story?" I'm just reading on the side in the Rashi. One time they forgot in Tzipori, in the city of Tzipori, they didn't bring the Torah from Erev Shabbos. They normally would leave, they would hide the Sefer Torah in one of the houses, because of the Goyim. The Goyim, they were afraid, they wanted somewhere to secure. And the house that they left it in was in one of the houses that's connected to the courtyard of the shul. And there were other houses, many houses, that were also open to that same courtyard. And they didn't make an Eruv Chatzeros. They didn't make an Eruv that would permit them to carry from their house and into the courtyard. Or another example was that maybe they had many courtyards opened up to one street, one dead end. And the shul was open to that dead end, that mavui. And the Sefer Torah was in the Chatzir, which was opposite the shul, and they couldn't get it to the shul because they didn't have shituf mavuos. So it basically, you need to either have a eruv chatzeros or shituf mavuos. They're both very similar. The concept is that you need, in order to carry from one domain to another, even though they're both private domains, you cannot carry unless you do this joint, this sort of like a joint communal type of housing, where each person donates, let's say, a matzah, and they together, they have all the matzahs there. It shows that they're all part of one domain, and therefore they can carry into their courtyard, or they can carry into their mavoi, and so on and so forth, and permit the carrying, which was biblically permissible, but rabbinically there's a problem. Now, they're not allowed to carry from their courtyards to this dead end street called a mavoi, so it's like a street that's closed off on one side and opened on the other side, and they're all opened up. There are different courtyards opened up to that mavoi, that street. So what do you do? So what did they do in Tzipori? So they figured out a way to do it, and this way, who gave them this heter? Rabbi Yishmael ben Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yishmael, the son of Rabbi Yossi, gave them this heter. We're going back to the Gemara now. The Gemara says that they didn't have the Torah. What did they do? Lemachar prirsu sadinen al gabe ha'amud. So what they did was, how did they get the Torah scroll to shul? They spread out sheets on top of these type of posts that were there. And by doing that, they had a mechitza, and they didn't have to deal with the other houses that were opened up to the courtyard, because they had a private path to the shul. And if you don't have to deal with the other houses, then the other houses don't prohibit their carrying from that courtyard into the shul. And so veheviu sefer Torah v'karabai, and they brought the sefer Torah, and they were able to read from the sefer Torah, because they have sort of removed the other housing. The other houses, they removed their portion of being part of the courtyard, and instead they made like a separate entrance from this house straight to the shul, and they could bring the Torah there, and they relied on the fact that these walls that they had spread, some type of sheets that they spread on top of posts, they were hanging walls. And the Gemara says, Pirsu salka daitach, do you really think that they brought, that they spread out sheets on walls? Where could they have brought them? Right? You have the same problem. You can't carry from the houses to the courtyard. And so how did they bring these sheets there? So the Gemara says, Ela shemotu sadinim prusim al gabe hoamudim, that they found on Erev Shabbos that there were these sheets that were already spread out on the posts. Now the understanding is not that they were fully spread out, but they were a little spread out, at least a tefach. And on Shabbos they spread them further. And
Rabbi, isn't that building?
so because they were already spread out, and it's only a arai, it's only a temporary type of mechitza or oil, it's not considered a problem. Because it was already partially an oihel, and it's only an arai, it's only a temporary.
It's still not building, the fact that you're extending the walls down.
Right, it's almost like on a baby carriage. If you have like that cover that, so as long as it has like, well, actually, I'm not sure how the place can hold, but if it's partially opened, then for sure you can continue to extend it, But anyway, the opinion of that's the opinion of some of the Rishonim. Rashi is more lenient with regard to the laws of mechitza on Shabbos, and he says that they possible that they could have spread this out even on Shabbos. It's not a problem. It's not usher. It's an oil arai. So it wouldn't be an issue.
So as long as they then, let's say, refold them up and put them back up so that it's not left permanently, then it was okay.
Right, because it's a temporary thing. Not on Shabbos. I don't know if they would take it down on Shabbos. I mean, not that it's a problem to. I guess if you could put it up, you could take it down. Not completely. You still leave like a tefach, hand breadth. But yeah, I guess we could look it up in Shulchan Aruch exactly what the way it talks about it, because in Shulchan Aruch it does talk about mechitza and oyel. It talks about both that are arai, that are temporary, and I think there's a difference between an oyel and a mechitza. But anyway, here the Gemara concludes and says they found them prusim spread out on the amudim, on these posts from Erev Shabbos. Ve'heviu Sefer Torah, they brought the Sefer Torah from the house. V'karubai, and they read from the Sefer Torah. And the conclusion of this Gemara is that Reb Yishmael, Reb Yosi, they were relying on him. Does Reb Yosi himself hold this way? Not necessarily. We don't know. It's possible that he argues on this, and that's the original statement of the Gemara, was that he argues on this, but his son was more lenient, and he allowed this type of thing. Yes, Victor.
Rabbi, it's an interesting story, but you would wonder why didn't they just tell the people, well, we'll go read the Torah over there. Everybody come, we'll listen, we'll read it, and then they wouldn't have to deal with this.
Because they don't daven with that other minion. The question I had was, you're ignoring them so you can have a path directly. The question is, if it's arai, do you have to invite them to Kiddush?
Yeah. It's an interesting story. I'm just saying it doesn't look like they said, wow, they didn't like weigh a bunch of possibilities. They just said, oh, we'll take the sheets, they're already there. We'll fix them a little bit.
And you do it. What it seems to me is that probably it was not convenient to use that house for the shul. Either the lights were off, it's a very tiny house, it would not have been.
The lights were off. What do you mean the lights were off?
Candles, there's no windows.
Right, okay, candles. I want to make sure we understand we're talking about candles.
Candles went out by then.
Maybe.
They were already out.
Rabbi,